Late August, 1944. Northern France still cloaked in mist. Through the slit windows of a commandeered chateau, German officers lean over maps stained with coffee rings and cigarette ash. Outside, the distant thud of V-1 launch ramps echoes like a heartbeat of vengeance. Inside, silence reigns, not the silence of confidence, but of disbelief. A crumpled report lies on the desk. Numbers circle in red pencil. 82% interception. Impossible. Ballistic probability, as every Luftwaffe technician knew, placed the chance of destroying a V-1 with flak at less than 1 in 10,000. Yet here, before their eyes, was mathematics that mocked their physics. Imagine yourself as a young engineer in that room. The air reeks of tobacco and fear. You steady the field telescope and witness a miracle, though not your own. A V-1 drone hums across the sky, a mechanical hornet bound for London. Flak shells erupt nearby, but instead of harmless blossoms of smoke, one detonation blossoms precisely beside the missile. A blinding flash. The V-1 tumbles, its pulse jet stuttering into silence before it plummets like a broken toy. Your superiors mutter about sabotage, about traitors in production lines. But deep down you sense something stranger. The Allies are wielding a weapon that shouldn't exist. Not faster aircraft, not lucky timing, but shells that seem to think, bursting in uncanny proximity. Now shift the camera. Across the channel, on the white cliffs of Dover, British gunners load shells into heavy barrels. They don't question why the ammunition feels different, why records demand every fired round be logged like crown jewels. Orders are simple: aim, fire, and trust. And when they squeeze the triggers, statistics warp into legend. This is the hidden duel that turned Hitler's vengeance weapon into a national embarrassment. A duel where physics textbooks were rewritten by engineers in Baltimore and Newark, and where women soldering vacuum tubes in Sylvania's factories unknowingly safeguarded London. And here's the irony: Germany's brightest minds dismissed the very concept years earlier. They believed no fuse could survive the shock of gunfire. They believed proximity detonation was a fantasy. And because they believed it impossible, they never saw it, even when captured examples sat, unnoticed, in their own depots. What you are about to discover is not just a tale of secret electronics. It is the story of how democracy's assembly lines outmaneuvered dictatorship's laboratories. How 22 million tiny devices, each costing less than a soldier's boots, humbled the Reich's wonder weapon. Stay with me. In the next chapters, we will peel back the layers, technical, tactical, and human, behind that extraordinary day when 82% of V-1s fell burning from the sky. If you want more stories where history reads like a thriller, subscribe and join this journey. Because the past is not just dates and names, it is a battlefield of ideas, and sometimes the smallest spark rewrites the war. The summer of 1944 was a season of paradox for Nazi Germany. On the one hand, the Wehrmacht still hurled formations of tanks and men against the Allies in Normandy, while in the east, the Red Army advanced relentlessly. On the other, the Reich's leadership clung to faith in its wonder weapons, machines of terror promised to reverse the tide. Chief among them was the Vergeltungswaffe 1, the V-1 flying bomb. The V-1 was not merely a missile, it was meant to be a psychological instrument. Launched from ramps in northern France, its distinct buzzing, like a motorbike without mufflers, earned it the nickname Buzz Bomb. Civilians in London learned to dread that sound, not because of its persistence but because of its sudden absence. When the engine cut, the bomb began its deadly dive. Each weapon carried roughly 850 kilograms of amytal explosive, enough to flatten a row of houses or destroy a bridge. At Peenemünde, the brain trust of German rocket science, optimism reigned. Engineers calculated interception to be nearly impossible. A V-1 streaked at 640 kilometers per hour, altitude shifting between 600 and 2,700 meters. For British fighter pilots, this meant a race against the clock, closing within 200 meters before firing, often risking their own destruction in the blast. As for anti-aircraft gunners, their chances seemed even more hopeless. Conventional time fuses demanded precise calculation. Estimate the target speed, predict position, set the fuse manually, and hoped that a steel shell would burst within lethal range. Against a fast, small target, success seemed mathematically negligible. Early results confirmed German confidence. On June 13, 1944, exactly 1 week after D-Day, the first V-1 struck London, killing 6 and injuring dozens. In the weeks that followed, missiles rained daily. Statistics suggested London could be overwhelmed. Even with a conservative 25% success rate, analysts predicted more tonnage of explosives would fall on the city than during the entire Blitz of 1940–41. In theory, Britain faced not just a weapon but a campaign of attrition. But war is not theory. By late June, German intelligence officers noticed a troubling anomaly. British interception rates climbed faster than expected, first 10%, then nearly a quarter of the incoming bombs. These numbers were high but still within the realm of adaptation. New radar techniques, better fighter tactics, perhaps luck. What followed in July, however, defied logic. Observers along the French coast recorded bombs bursting mid-air without direct hits. Anti-aircraft gunners, it seemed, were destroying V-1s with uncanny precision. For the men of Flak Regiment 155W, stationed in France to monitor results, the reports created chaos. Meetings stretched late into the night as technicians scoured for explanations. Could sabotage be at work? Were the bombs malfunctioning in flight? Inspections revealed nothing. V-1s launched over German-controlled territory behaved normally. The mystery existed only when they crossed the English coast. Inside the Reich, commanders turned to scapegoats. Some blamed poor morale among launch crews, others suspected British counterintelligence tricking statistics. Yet the numbers refused to yield. From June's modest 17% interception rate, the British coastal gun belt surged to 74% by August. Then, in one extraordinary day, the unthinkable occurred. 82% of all launched V-1s were shot down before reaching their targets. The German scientific community found itself cornered. For years they had debated the concept of proximity detonation, devices that could sense a target and explode at just the right moment. Dozens of designs had been tested in German labs, all failing to survive the colossal stresses of gunfire, acceleration exceeding 20,000 g, rotation at 25,000 revolutions per minute, and extremes of heat and cold. Vacuum tubes shattered, batteries went dead, and circuits failed. The conclusion was unanimous. Such a weapon was impossible. And so, in August 1944, the Reich confronted an impossible reality. British shells were bursting not randomly but deliberately close to their targets. Self-thinking ammunition, though dismissed as fantasy, was annihilating Hitler's vengeance weapon. Across the Channel, the picture looked very different. British gunners did not understand the secret in their hands. They were told only that their ammunition was special and that every shell must be accounted for. American-designed SCR-584 radar units scanned the sky, locking onto V-1 trajectories, feeding data directly to the guns. When the trigger was pulled, shells armed with variable time fuses, coded VT to conceal their true purpose, leapt into the sky. Inside each was a miniature radio transmitter. As the shell closed on the drone, reflected signals triggered detonation within lethal proximity. Near misses became direct hits. By the final week of August, the system functioned like a machine. Radar tracked, guns fired, fuses calculated, bombs fell. For London, this meant survival. For Germany, it was technological humiliation. The terrifying buzz of the V-1 no longer signaled doom but hinted at its own defeat. The broader problem lay deeper. German reliance on wonder weapons had always carried risk. Each device, jet fighters, rockets, guided missiles, consumed vast resources, demanded scarce skilled labor, and relied on forced workers in underground factories. Meanwhile, the Allies emphasized technologies that multiplied effectiveness of existing systems. The proximity fuse did not require new guns or aircraft. It transformed every artillery shell into a precision instrument. Where Germany pursued perfection in isolated projects, America mass-produced effectiveness by the million. Thus, the stage was set for one of the war's great ironies. A weapon designed to break Britain instead showcased the fatal blind spot of the Reich's scientific establishment. Their disbelief in what was possible became a strategic weakness. By the time they realized the truth, it was already too late. At the heart of this story lies a paradox. German scientists had calculated, with cold precision, that destroying a V-1 in flight by gunfire was nearly impossible. Yet in late August 1944, British gunners were not only succeeding, they were doing so with breathtaking regularity. What changed was not the courage of the crews, but the nature of the shells they fired. To understand the transformation, picture the battlefield before the fuse. In June 1944, if a gun crew wanted to stop a single flying bomb, they would have to blacken the sky with steel. 2,000, sometimes more than that, heavy shells would be hurled upward before luck delivered a kill. It was like trying to swat a wasp with a fistful of gravel. The odds were punishing, the effort exhausting, and the city below largely unprotected. Then came the proximity fuse. A device no larger than a clenched hand turned guesswork into near certainty. Inside its shell was a miniature radio transmitter, constantly sending out signals. When the signal bounced back from a solid object, the metal skin of a V-1, the circuit tripped, and the warhead detonated at the perfect instant. Suddenly, gunners did not need to land a direct hit. Being close was enough. The effect was as if the shells had grown eyes. The numbers, once cruel, became almost merciful. Instead of 2,000 bursts to bring down one bomb, crews now needed closer to 100. That difference was not abstract. It was the measure of whole neighborhoods saved, of fires that never started, of families who woke to silence instead of rubble. Technically, the challenge had seemed insurmountable. A shell leaves the barrel with a violence few machines on Earth endure. 20,000 times the force of gravity, a spin faster than any turbine, heat like a furnace at the core and chill like the Arctic a second later. To put it another way, if a human body were subjected to such stress, the bones would shatter before the mind could register pain. Yet American engineers somehow persuaded fragile vacuum tubes and tiny batteries to survive this journey intact. Factories across the United States became temples of precision. Sylvania reimagined hearing aid components into miniature tubes rugged enough to ride a shell's violent path. Crosley, once famous for radios and refrigerators, churned out thousands of fuses daily. By 1944, production reached a rhythm almost absurd in its scale. 40,000 new fuses every single day, more in a month than Germany could launch V-1s in the entire war. Think about that for a moment. On one side, the Reich deployed its vengeance weapons in salvos of a few dozen each night, each missile costing thousands of Reichsmarks and the lives of slave laborers in underground factories. On the other, America shipped crates of smart ammunition across the Atlantic, each device cheaper than a soldier's boots, yet capable of neutralizing those expensive machines of terror. For German observers, the sight was maddening. They watched their proud missiles shatter in midair, surrounded by bursts that seemed too distant to matter. Through their telescopes, the math refused to add up. Physics does not allow this, one officer muttered, but reality cared little for his textbooks. The transformation rippled beyond mathematics. In June, the average London family lived under constant dread. Each siren could signal disaster. Each passing buzz might be the last sound before death. By August, the same family still trembled, but often the noise ended in a distant flash over the channel. Instead of fire on their streets, they heard only the dull thud of falling wreckage. Technology had not only saved lives, it had given back the possibility of sleep. And yet, secrecy cloaked the miracle. British crews were never told how their shells worked. Orders simply demanded accuracy, discipline, and absolute accounting of every round. If a fuse failed to detonate, it had to be retrieved at once, guarded like a crown jewel. Naval patrols prowled the waters to ensure no dud reached enemy hands. The secret was guarded so fiercely that even when German troops captured entire stockpiles of ammunition during the Battle of the Bulge, they never realized they were holding the very ghost that haunted their V-1 campaign. By late summer, the arithmetic was inescapable. Of more than 9,000 V-1s launched from French sites toward Britain, only about a quarter reached their targets. Civilian casualties, while grievous, stood at a fraction of what had been forecast. London was wounded, but not broken. The difference lay in millions of tiny circuits, each one an unheralded soldier in the war for survival. By the final week of August 1944, the system reached its brutal efficiency. Radar on the coast swept the sky with invisible fingers, locking on to the mechanical buzz of the drones. Data traveled straight into gun directors, which swung barrels into place as if operated by a single hand. And when the trigger was pulled, the miracle repeated itself. Shells rose, proximity fuses listened, and V-1s fell. The effect was so dramatic that German analysts thought their statistics corrupted. How could the British report destruction rates above 70% when their textbooks insisted success should barely reach 2? When the figure of 82% appeared in a single day's log, it was treated like heresy. Generals convened crisis meetings. Technicians rechecked missiles for defects. Launch crews swore their loyalty. Yet every test over German territory proved the bombs sound. Only over England did they collapse, as if the channel itself contained some invisible curse. The curse, of course, was industrial logic. America had solved problems Germany declared impossible, then multiplied the solution at a scale no dictatorship could match. By 1945, more than 22 million fuses had rolled off assembly lines, at a cost exceeding $1 billion wartime dollars. To the Reich scientists, the number was incomprehensible. Their laboratories produced prototypes in handfuls. Their factories relied on forced laborers, starving underground. Against that, the Allies mobilized a volunteer workforce, women working 12-hour shifts in well-lit plants, soldering wires they didn't understand but believing they mattered. Consider the contrast in human terms. Each V-1 carried the weight of suffering, thousands of prisoners in camps like Mittelbau-Dora, stripped of dignity to feed the Reich's arsenal. Each proximity fuse carried the fingerprints of ordinary workers in Ohio or New York, paid overtime, returning home to families at night. One weapon was born of cruelty, the other of collaboration. And yet, the technical marvel should not be understated. Inside every fuse lay a radio no larger than a walnut, whispering signals at millions of cycles per second. Each whisper rebounded from the skin of a flying bomb, like a bat detecting prey in the dark. The circuit responded in microseconds, detonating the warhead at the moment of deadliest effect. A few meters too soon, and fragments scattered harmlessly. A few meters too late, and the target escaped. But when tuned correctly, the timing was uncanny. German observers, watching through lenses, saw explosions bloom at just the right instant, as if the shells themselves had chosen the kill. The physics was unforgiving. Acceleration of 20,000 times gravity is not an abstraction. It is the equivalent of a car smashing into a wall at highway speed, repeated 20,000 times in the blink of an eye. And yet, the fragile glass of vacuum tubes endured. Sylvania's engineers, drawing on hearing aid designs, reinforced them with alloys and precise geometries. Batteries, dormant for years in storage, came alive only when the shock of firing broke their seals. Each fuse was tested, sampled, and sometimes fired in trial guns to prove reliability. Failure rates sank below 2%, a miracle of quality control, given the millions produced. Numbers again reveal the scale. In June, Londoners faced casualties projected at 4 or 5 times the eventual total. By the campaign's end, just over 6,000 civilians had been killed. Tragic, yet far fewer than the tens of thousands feared. The cost was still heavy. Nearly 18,000 injured, homes shattered, lives uprooted. But without the fuses, those numbers would have multiplied until the capital bled dry. German blindness deepened the irony. The Oslo report of 1939 had hinted at Allied research in proximity fuses, but German scientists dismissed it as disinformation. Over 30 domestic designs were attempted, none reaching combat readiness. And so, when American devices finally appeared, their existence contradicted the Reich's own worldview. Even when fate handed them captured examples, whole stockpiles seized in Belgium, they never believed what lay in their hands. To understand why, imagine a chess master refusing to see a checkmate because the move seemed impossible. German engineers assumed their opponents were playing the same game, bound by the same rules of physics as they understood them. But their rivals had bent the rules with industrial-scale ingenuity. By the time the Reich recognized the truth, London was already safe, and the V-1 campaign was a failure written in smoke across the Channel sky. The lesson was harsh but enduring. In modern war, perfection in design matters less than effectiveness multiplied by scale. Germany produced brilliant aircraft, terrifying rockets, weapons that dazzled on paper. America produced devices that worked, and then produced them by the millions. The proximity fuse did not merely defend London, it redefined warfare itself. The first V-1 struck London before dawn on June 13, 1944. A week had passed since Allied troops stormed ashore at Normandy, and Hitler's promised Vergeltungswaffe, the weapon of vengeance, finally entered its war. At 4:25 a.m., the drone of a pulse jet broke across the capital. It ended in a deafening explosion at Grove Road in Bow, collapsing houses, killing 6, injuring 30, and leaving 200 homeless. For Londoners, who had endured the Blitz years earlier, the old terror returned in a new form. But unlike the Blitz, there was no enemy pilot to fear, no adversary to outmaneuver. The V-1 was a machine, indifferent, unstoppable once launched. It traveled at speeds of 640 kilometers per hour, faster than most British fighters could safely intercept at low altitude. It flew straight, powered by its crude Argus pulse jet, carrying nearly a ton of Amatol. To those on the ground, its approach was unmistakable, a rattling, stuttering engine that seemed almost comical until the moment the sound stopped. Silence meant death was seconds away. At first, Britain struggled. Interceptions depended largely on fighters. Pilots of Spitfires, Tempests, and even the new Gloucester Meteor jet scrambled to chase the buzzing intruders. The tactics were desperate and dangerous. Some pilots fired directly into the drones, risking detonation. Others developed a maneuver so reckless it seemed like suicide, flying alongside, slipping a wingtip under the V-1's wing, and nudging it off balance. The bomb would tumble, crash harmlessly into fields, or explode in mid-air. Newspapers celebrated such feats, but even heroism had limits. With dozens of bombs crossing daily, no air force could swat them all. On the ground, anti-aircraft crews struggled with their own odds. Radar tracked the missiles, guns filled the sky with fire, but statistics remained cruel. Thousands of shells for a single kill meant wasted ammunition and devastated morale. Early interception rates hovered at a meager 10 to 15%. In German command posts across northern France, officers reported results with satisfaction. Major General Max Wachtel, commanding Flak Regiment 155W, the unit overseeing V-1 operations, believed London was finally being brought to its knees. Yet by late June, cracks appeared in this confidence. Reports reached Berlin that British defenses were adapting faster than expected. Kill rates doubled, then tripled. Observers noted that gunners were claiming kills with astonishingly little expenditure. Through binoculars, German spotters saw V-1s flying steady one moment, then erupting into fire even though bursts appeared too far away to matter. Engineers shook their heads. Their calculations said no. A shell exploding tens of meters off target should shred nothing but air. And yet, bombs fell. The shift intensified in July. The Allies reorganized their defenses into what became known as the coastal gun belt. Anti-aircraft units withdrew from scattered inland sites and redeployed along the southern coast of England, forming a dense line of fire that V-1s had to cross before reaching cities. The logic was brutal and effective. Concentrate firepower where every missile was guaranteed to pass, and ensure that dud shells fell harmlessly into the channel rather than populated areas. Behind the scenes, the secret weapon came into play. American-built SCR-584 radar units, capable of automatic tracking, guided the guns. The ammunition itself, however, was the true revolution. Fitted with a variable time, VT Fuze, each shell could sense when it neared a target and detonate at the lethal instant. To British gunners, the difference felt almost supernatural. In June, they had watched their rounds blossom into empty clouds. By July, those blossoms ended with burning wreckage tumbling from the sky. Londoners noticed the change too. At first, the city had braced for devastation greater than the Blitz. But as weeks passed, the expected inferno failed to materialize. The bombs still came, thousands of them, but more and more exploded harmlessly above fields, villages, or the Channel itself. A mother in South London recalled, years later, how she clutched her children when the sirens wailed. By mid-July, she said, the sky answered back. The sense of helplessness gave way to cautious hope. For the Germans, hope curdled into confusion. Wachtel's regiment logged interception rates climbing to 30%, then 50%. Some days exceeded 60%. He demanded explanations from engineers at Peenemünde. They examined captured fragments of shells, interviewed agents, and scoured intelligence reports. Theories abounded. Perhaps the British had perfected radar-guided guns, or devised new time fuses with faster adjustment. But none accounted for the precision observed. Still, confidence lingered in Berlin. The V-1 campaign was designed not only to inflict damage but to sap British morale. Even if thousands were intercepted, hundreds still got through. Each carried destruction enough to level streets, to fill headlines, to remind the Allies that the Reich could strike back even as it retreated in Normandy. The campaign continued. Launch ramps multiplied. Salvos grew larger. London braced, and gunners prepared. By late July, the duel reached a turning point. The skies over southern England no longer resembled blind chance but choreographed defense. Radar picked targets, guns responded instantly, shells found their marks. To outside observers, it looked as though British gunners had mastered a dark art. The truth was more astonishing. They were firing ammunition that seemed to think. The month of July 1944 unfolded like a duel fought in silence. Each dawn brought the low drone of V-1s across the Channel. Each dusk ended with tallies of destruction. Bombs launched, bombs downed, bombs that slipped through to scar London streets. On paper, the numbers shifted dramatically. In June, gunners celebrated if they stopped 1 in 5. By mid-July, nearly half were falling short of their targets. The difference was not in the courage of crews, but in the unseen circuits riding inside their shells. From Dover to Portsmouth, the coastal gun belt turned into a living wall. Batteries stood shoulder to shoulder, barrels trained toward the horizon. SCR 584 radar stations fed targeting data with eerie precision. To the crews, the work felt mechanical: detect, aim, fire, repeat. Yet the results astonished them. A gunner described watching bursts appear several dozen meters from a V-1, only for the drone to cartwheel downward seconds later. It was as if the shell had made up its own mind, he recalled. Few knew they were firing the most closely guarded secret of the war. On the German side, disbelief deepened. Reports arrived at the chateau headquarters of Flak Regiment 155W, where Max Wachtel pored over figures with growing frustration. The mathematics defied explanation. Instructors at Luftwaffe schools had drilled the odds into their students. One direct hit required 10,000 shells. And yet, British gunners now seemed to achieve kills with a fraction of that expenditure. Wachtel ordered investigations. Launch ramps were inspected for flaws, engines retested, explosive loads examined. Each test came back normal. The bombs were not failing, they were being defeated. By the third week of July, the evidence could no longer be denied. London was not collapsing. Buildings still fell, civilians still died, but the great catastrophe promised by Hitler had not arrived. Instead, the capital adapted, even mocked the so-called doodlebugs. Newspapers printed cartoons of housewives shaking fists at the sky. Children learned to imitate the stuttering buzz, chasing each other in streets as though it were a game. Terror, though still present, had lost its sharpest edge. And then came August. In the final days of that summer month, the defense reached its zenith. British gunners, fully integrated with radar, fully supplied with VT fuses, operated at a level the Germans could not conceive. On one extraordinary day, 82% of all incoming V-1s were destroyed before they reached London. For the Reich's engineers, such a figure belonged to fantasy. For those in the capital, it meant survival. The technical miracle intertwined with industrial might. By then, American factories produced 40,000 fuses daily. Each one cost less than a good pair of boots, yet it turned every anti-aircraft gun into a predator. In contrast, Each V-1 consumed precious fuel, metals, and forced labor. The imbalance was grotesque. The Reich invested thousands of Reichsmarks into every missile, while the Allies spent a mere handful of dollars to knock it from the sky. Still, the V-1 campaign inflicted suffering. By late August, more than 2,000 bombs had struck London, killing thousands, injuring tens of thousands. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. But those losses, tragic as they were, represented a fraction of what had been feared. General Frederick Pyle, head of Britain's anti-aircraft command, later estimated casualties would have been 4 to 5 times greater without the fuse. In other words, the small circuits hidden in shells had saved tens of thousands of lives. From the German perspective, the inability to solve the mystery bred paranoia. Wachtel suspected sabotage, perhaps even treachery within his own ranks. Rumors spread of British counterintelligence altering data, of Allied spies corrupting statistics. Yet frontline observers insisted on what they saw with their own eyes. Missiles disintegrating in midair, shredded not by luck, but by precision. At Peenemünde, the center of rocket development, scientists convened emergency conferences. Could the British have achieved the impossible? Could proximity detonation, long dismissed as fantasy, now be real? Some younger engineers whispered yes, recalling rumors from pre-war intelligence about Allied experiments. Veterans scoffed. No glass tube can survive the gun, one declared. That conviction blinded them even as their weapons fell in flames. By early September, the verdict of the skies was clear. The V-1 offensive had failed to achieve its strategic aim. It had killed, it had scarred, but it had not broken Britain. Instead, it revealed the chasm between two systems of war. Germany prized singular brilliance, secret projects, wonder weapons. The Allies prized collaboration, mass production, technologies that multiplied the power of existing arms. One side produced a handful of machines meant to terrify. The other produced millions of devices that quietly, relentlessly, nullified them. The duel was not over. V-2 rockets would soon follow, but in that summer of 1944, the tide turned. A city survived not through heroism alone, but through circuits the size of a thumbnail, built by workers who never knew what they held in their hands. By September 1944, the V-1 campaign was visibly faltering. Launch ramps in northern France, once roaring each night with a throb of pulse jets, stood silent as Allied armies pushed inland after the breakout from Normandy. The occupation of Pas-de-Calais deprived Germany of its best firing grounds. What had been daily terror for London turned into sporadic attacks, fewer and less effective. Statistics told the story mercilessly. Of the 9,521 V-1s launched from fixed sites against Britain, only 2,515 ever reached the capital. Nearly 3/4 were destroyed in transit. To put it in human terms, for every family that lost a home, 3 others were spared because a fuse detonated at the right instant. The Germans had hoped to level London. Instead, they exhausted resources to kill in fractions. The Reich did not abandon its vengeance easily. Engineers searched for ways to outwit the defenses. Launch angles were varied, altitudes shifted, salvos increased. Some bombs were fired at night, when visibility was poorest. Others were released in bad weather, hoping to blind radar. Yet the results remained stubbornly unchanged. Radar locked on regardless of clouds. Fuses did not need daylight, they detonated by sensing, not by seeing. The same pattern repeated, the buzz, the burst, the fall. In desperation, Germany tried air-launching V-1s from Heinkel bombers over the North Sea. The strategy extended reach but not effectiveness. Bomber crews braved British patrols only to release missiles that met the same fate. On August's best day for the Allies, 82% of bombs had been intercepted. In September, the average still hovered above 70. No tactical trick could break the invisible wall. Londoners, though relieved, still lived under strain. Each raid carried its quota of tragedy. Entire streets could vanish in seconds when a missile slipped through. The sirens still howled, the shelters still filled, the city still bled. Yet there was resilience in the air, a sense that technology was finally tilting fortune in their favor. Unlike the Blitz of 1940, When civilians endured night after night of devastation, 1944 brought a cautious confidence. "We learned to wait for the flak," one survivor remembered. "If the sky flashed before the noise stopped, we knew we were safe." For German scientists, the months after September were bitter. Interrogations after the war revealed their disbelief. Some insisted the British must have devised entirely new anti-aircraft guns. Others clung to the idea of sabotage in their own ranks. Only a few dared suggest proximity detonation. Even then, the notion was dismissed by superiors as science fiction. "If such a device existed," one engineer said flatly, "we would have built it first." That arrogance blinded them to reality, even when it lay smoldering across the Channel. As the Allies advanced, the V-1 sites fell one by one. The campaign's center of gravity shifted eastward. New launch positions were established in the Low Countries, sending bombs toward Antwerp, Brussels, and other liberated cities. These targets lacked Britain's dense defenses. Casualties there were heavier, though never enough to alter the war's course. Once again, the Reich diverted vast resources into an effort that inflicted pain but achieved nothing strategically. In the autumn of 1944, Hitler pinned new hopes on the V-2 rocket. Unlike the V-1, it was unstoppable. It descended from the stratosphere faster than sound, invisible to radar, immune to interception. Yet the V-2, for all its terror, lacked the volume to match its promise. Fewer were launched, production faltered, and accuracy was poor. They struck London, yes, but sporadically. Where the V-1 had buzzed, the V-2 struck like lightning, terrifying but rare. Still, in the corridors of German command, the humiliation of the V-1 haunted them. They had promised a weapon to shatter morale, yet it became a symbol of impotence. A missile meant to terrify instead showcased the Reich's blindness to industrial reality. British gunners, firing shells that seemed to think, had nullified years of German engineering. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the American production lines reached their crescendo. By late 1944, more than $1 billion had been spent on proximity fuses, an astronomical figure for the era. 22 million units had been manufactured. Crosley alone produced 5 million, Sylvania hundreds of thousands of tubes per day. The numbers dwarfed anything Germany could imagine. In a sense, the Reich was not defeated by science alone, but by an economy that could outproduce any miracle. The V-1 campaign closed not with a bang but with attrition. By the end of 1944, London was still standing. Its people were bruised, but not broken. Its defenses, once mocked, had become a marvel. For the Germans, the campaign ended in silence. Launch ramps abandoned, propaganda muted, officers left to explain why their wonder weapon had fallen to pieces over the Channel. But history remembers the contrast. On one side, a dictatorship consumed by dreams of terror weapons. On the other, democracies that harnessed collaboration, mass production, and quiet ingenuity. The skies of 1944 proved which vision held power. By winter 1944, the V-1 campaign was a shadow of its former self. The guns of the coastal belt, the radar stations, and above all the proximity fuses had drained its menace. Where once salvos rattled nightly across the Channel, now only scattered flights reached the skies above London. The Allies' advance across France had overrun most of the launch ramps. The doodlebug had become less a weapon of war than a relic of failure. Yet failure did not lessen its sting. Each missile that slipped through remained capable of killing dozens. In December, as Hitler launched the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, London endured renewed raids. But the city no longer cowered as it had in June. By then, its defenders knew the rhythm of the duel, radar searching, guns firing, shells bursting at the exact instant to slice missiles from the sky. Civilians, though weary, carried themselves with a defiance unbroken by months of bombardment. German desperation led to experiments bordering on futility. Crews tried clustering salvos, hoping to overwhelm defenses with sheer volume. They varied courses, altitudes, and launch intervals. None of it changed the arithmetic. British guns, guided by radar and empowered by VT fuses, could handle streams as easily as singletons. The gunners themselves had become almost detached from the spectacle. It was routine by then, one veteran recalled. Track, aim, fire, watch it fall. We didn't think of them as terror weapons anymore, just targets. The Germans never truly grasped why. Captured documents after the war revealed the extent of their ignorance. At Peenemünde, some scientists began to suspect proximity detonation, but superiors dismissed the idea as impossible. In the field, officers blamed everything from faulty engines to British trickery. Even when German forces captured American stockpiles of VT ammunition during the Ardennes offensive, they failed to recognize their significance. The fuses looked too delicate, too implausible to have survived the blast of a gun barrel. Blinded by their own disbelief, they overlooked the very secret that defeated them. By early 1945, the campaign sputtered to its end. Of nearly 25,000 V-1s produced in the war, fewer than half ever reached intended targets. In Britain alone, more than 6,000 civilians had been killed, nearly 18,000 wounded. These were tragedies beyond measure, but they were far fewer than the devastation originally planned. Without the fuse, those numbers might have multiplied 4- or 5-fold. The technology had not erased suffering, but it had spared a capital from annihilation. Meanwhile, the Reich shifted its focus to the V-2 rocket. These supersonic missiles defied interception entirely, falling on London without warning. Yet they arrived in such limited numbers, and with such poor accuracy, that they achieved little beyond terror. The V-1 had promised a storm. The V-2 delivered lightning flashes. Neither changed the outcome of the war. In hindsight, the V-1 campaign reads like a parable of modern conflict. Germany invested its dwindling resources into a wonder weapon, assuming shock and terror would substitute for strategic depth. The Allies invested in an invisible solution, mass-produced in millions, that turned the tables without fanfare. One side built machines to terrify. The other built devices to neutralize terror. On the ground, the contrast was stark. The V-1 factories, hidden deep in underground complexes, relied on slave labor. Thousands of prisoners perished under brutal conditions, building weapons meant to kill civilians who had never heard their names. Across the ocean, American women soldered wires and assembled circuits in factories humming with overtime. They did not know exactly what they built, only that it mattered. When the war ended, they learned they had been the unseen defenders of London. The campaign left behind ruins, but also revelations. German engineers who examined captured fuses after surrender could scarcely believe what they held. Tubes that survived 20,000 Gs, batteries that activated only after firing, circuits that functioned flawlessly after years in storage. It contradicted everything they had believed. One confessed that Germany was 10 years behind such technology. For London, survival was measured not in rhetoric but in lives spared. A city that expected to be reduced to ashes stood scarred but standing, its people hardened rather than broken. For Germany, the V-1 became a bitter reminder. Their brilliant machines, painstakingly crafted, had been undone by cheap, mass-produced electronics costing less than a pair of boots. The last buzz bombs fell in early 1945, more nuisance than nightmare. By then, Allied troops were advancing into the Reich itself. The war had moved on, but the lessons of the V-1 duel lingered. Warfare was no longer simply about firepower or courage. It was about whose factories, whose engineers, whose workers could bend science to serve survival. The case of the V-1 was proof. Numbers alone did not lie. In 1 week of August 1944, 82% of Hitler's vengeance weapons never crossed the Channel. In those explosions overhead, the very nature of war had shifted. The smallest circuits had changed the largest battles. When historians look back at the duel between the V-1 and the proximity fuse, they see more than a clash of weapons. They see two visions of war colliding, one rooted in spectacle and singular genius, the other in mass production and incremental efficiency. The contrast is as stark as the difference between a cathedral and a factory. One soaring, magnificent, but slow to build, the other plain, repetitive, but relentless. Germany believed in wonder weapons. From the Me-262 jet fighter to the V-2 rocket, Its leaders placed faith in breakthroughs so dazzling they would shock the enemy into submission. Each project consumed immense resources, demanded scarce technical skill, and was wrapped in secrecy so tight it strangled flexibility. The V-1 embodied this mindset. It was innovative, yes, but also fragile, costly, and strategically shallow. The Allies, by contrast, pursued weapons that multiplied the effectiveness of what already existed. They did not invent a wholly new air defense system. They made old guns far deadlier. They did not demand pilots perform acrobatics at lethal range. They gave shells the ability to think. The VT Fuze was not glamorous. It did not look impressive on a propaganda poster. But it made every anti-aircraft gun 5 to 10 times more effective overnight. That quiet multiplication mattered far more than 1,000 promises of a technological miracle. Numbers illustrate the divide with cruel clarity. Germany built nearly 25,000 V-1s in the war. America built 22 million proximity fuses. Each V-1 consumed thousands of Reichsmarks and the lives of forced laborers in underground factories. Each fuse cost less than $20 by 1945, produced by workers who returned home each evening. The Reich crafted a handful of swords. The Allies forged millions of scalpels. In the arithmetic of war, the outcome was inevitable. The German error ran deeper than production. It was philosophical. At Piedmont, engineers dismissed proximity detonation because they could not imagine solving its problems. The stresses of firing, 20,000 G, extreme heat, rapid spin, seemed insurmountable. So they concluded it was impossible. That conviction became dogma. Even when evidence mounted that the British were using something extraordinary, German scientists clung to denial. In effect, they lost not to technology itself but to their own disbelief. Allied engineers approached the same challenge differently. They did not assume perfection from the start. They built, tested, failed, and built again. Miniaturized tubes shattered. Reinforced them with alloys. Batteries went dead. Designed them to wake only when fired. Quality control seemed overwhelming. Divide production into 110 factories, each responsible for a fragment, so no worker could leak the full secret. What Germany abandoned as fantasy, America turned into routine. There is irony here. The Reich prided itself on scientific rigor, yet it dismissed an entire branch of possibility. The democracies, supposedly slower, muddling, committee-driven, achieved what the dictatorship could not: a collaboration between scientists, engineers, and industrialists that made fantasy real. Dr. Merle Tuve, who led the project, later remarked that success came not from a lone genius but from systematic cooperation. That cooperation was something totalitarianism struggled to foster. Strategically, too, the differences mattered. The V-1 was meant to terrorize civilians into submission. But terror is a brittle weapon. Once defenses improved, once people realized survival was possible, the fear lost its edge. The VT Fuze, by contrast, had no psychological weakness. It did not depend on morale, it depended on circuits and production. Each day factories turned out tens of thousands more, each day defenses grew stronger. One side played with nerves, the other with numbers. Perhaps the most tragic irony was Germany's near miss with the truth. In the Ardennes, German troops overran American depots and captured crates of VT ammunition. The fuses were in their hands, intact. Yet they never recognized what they had seized. Their worldview blinded them. They believed no glass tube could survive the gun. And so they held salvation and let it slip through their fingers. The Allies, meanwhile, enforced secrecy so fiercely it cost lives. Proximity fuses were withheld from ground combat until December 1944, lest a dud fall into enemy hands. Thousands of soldiers died in Normandy, in the hedgerows, in the battles of France, without the help of artillery that could have been far more lethal. The decision was ruthless but calculated. Protecting the secret mattered more than short-term gain. When the fuses were finally released for artillery in the Ardennes, they devastated German infantry, shredding entire formations in the snow. What had saved London now saved Allied armies. So the errors were not merely technical. They were errors of imagination, of strategy, of philosophy. Germany trusted terror and brilliance. The Allies trusted collaboration and scale. The Reich's laboratories built weapons of awe. America's factories built weapons that worked. In the end, the contrast can be summarized in one chilling figure. On that August day in 1944, 82% of Hitler's vengeance weapons fell before reaching London. Each fall was a small explosion, a victory measured not in parades but in survival. The Reich never understood how. That ignorance was its greatest mistake. The end of the V-1 campaign did not merely close a chapter of the air war over Europe. It signaled a shift in the very nature of modern conflict. The duel between Hitler's wonder weapon and the Allies' invisible fuse left lessons that reached far beyond the ruins of London or the empty launch ramps of Pas-de-Calais. Strategically, the failure of the V-1 demonstrated the limits of terror as a weapon. Hitler had believed that raining bombs on a capital city would break civilian morale, just as he had once hoped during the Blitz. But by 1944, Britain had learned resilience. Civilians did not crumble, they adapted. They mocked the doodlebugs, turned survival into routine, and found strength in each day the city endured. The weapon intended to break their will became instead a symbol of their defiance. The Allies' success in shooting down most of the missiles only hardened that defiance. Terror, once resisted, becomes powerless. For Germany, the campaign drained resources that might have been decisive elsewhere. Each V-1 consumed metals, explosives, and fuel in a war where shortages strangled every front. Each required skilled oversight at Peenemünde and brutal labor in underground camps. Tens of thousands of prisoners perished assembling machines that achieved little. In cold arithmetic, the V-1 was a misallocation of a collapsing economy, a fantasy indulged at the expense of reality. The Allies, by contrast, proved that investment in multiplying technologies could change the course of war. The proximity fuse did not require inventing an entirely new weapon, it enhanced what already existed. Anti-aircraft guns, radar stations, even shells, none were new. What was new was the fuse that turned them into precision instruments. In this sense, the fuse foreshadowed the post-war revolution in military technology. Victory not from singular machines but from networks of systems, each reinforcing the other. Technologically, the VT Fuze stood as one of the war's great breakthroughs, rivaled only by radar, jet propulsion, and the atomic bomb. Its legacy rippled across decades. The principle of a miniature electronic brain guiding detonation became the foundation of modern air defense systems. Radar altimeters in aircraft, proximity warheads in missiles, even electronic fuses in artillery all drew from the wartime achievement. Engineers who once soldered tubes for anti-aircraft shells later built circuits for the Cold War's arsenal. The leap was not in raw power but in control, knowing not just how to destroy, but when. The fuse also symbolized the triumph of industrial democracy over totalitarian rigidity. In Germany, secrecy and centralization created brittle innovation. Ideas were confined to laboratories, divorced from mass production. In America, the challenge was broken into fragments, shared across more than 100 factories. No single worker knew the whole design, but together they created millions. Women formed the backbone of the workforce, many of them unaware of the true nature of their labor. They discovered only after the war that their hands had shielded London. That revelation became part of the larger narrative of home front contribution, proving that wars are won not only by soldiers but by citizens with soldering irons and assembly lines. Psychologically, the proximity fuse reshaped confidence. For Britain, it turned despair into hope. For Germany, it turned pride into humiliation. Interrogations after the war revealed how deep the shock ran. German scientists, shown captured fuses, shook their heads in disbelief. They had insisted no vacuum tube could survive gunfire. Now they held proof that it could, and had, millions of times. One admitted Germany was 10 years behind. The discovery was not just technical defeat but intellectual humiliation. Their failure was not only to build, but to imagine. The secrecy surrounding the fuse amplified its mystique. During the war, It was guarded with the same intensity as the Manhattan Project. Even British gunners did not know what gave their shells such deadly precision. Every unexploded round was retrieved at once, sometimes at the cost of lives, to prevent German capture. Naval patrols swept the channel for duds. The decision to withhold the Fuse from ground combat until December 1944 meant thousands of Allied soldiers died in Normandy and beyond, but commanders judged the risk worthwhile. When the Fuses were finally unleashed during the Battle of the Bulge, their effect was devastating. German infantry advancing through snowstorms suddenly found shells exploding overhead with uncanny accuracy. Entire formations were shredded. In that moment, the Fuse proved not only a defender of cities but a killer of armies. Long after the war, the lessons endured. Military strategists saw in the V-1 duel the futility of relying on terror weapons and the power of integrating science with mass production. Politicians saw the value of secrecy and the ability of democratic societies to mobilize industry. Engineers saw the future of electronics, rugged, miniaturized, and decisive. The VT Fuze may not have carried the same apocalyptic aura as the atomic bomb, but in its own way, it transformed warfare just as profoundly. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was philosophical. The Fuse proved that small, invisible innovations could outweigh grandiose machines. The Reich built rockets to awe the world. The Allies built circuits that worked quietly, unseen, until they detonated. In the long run, it was the circuits that mattered. Modern warfare became less about spectacle and more about systems, networks of sensors, processors, and weapons working in harmony. The proximity fuse was the first of these quiet revolutions. And there was irony in abundance. Germany's own arrogance, its refusal to believe the possible, ensured its downfall. America's willingness to attempt the improbable, to persist through failures, and to trust in cooperation secured success. The Fuse was not just a weapon. It was a mirror held to two systems, one rigid, the other adaptive. One that demanded obedience, the other that invited collaboration. In that reflection lay the difference between defeat and victory. By September 1945, the secret was finally revealed. Newspapers reported the existence of the proximity fuse, hailing it as one of the war's decisive inventions, surpassed only by the atomic bomb. To Londoners who had survived the summer of 1944, the announcement explained what they had sensed but never understood. The flashes in the sky, the sudden falls, the improbable salvation, it had all come from circuits built half a world away. The war ended, but the memory endured. Each unexploded shell recovered, each V-1 shattered in midair, each family spared became part of the invisible tally of the fuse. It was proof that sometimes the smallest spark, the tiniest glass tube, the faintest radio whisper, can decide the fate of nations. The story of the V-1 and the proximity fuse is not only about weapons. It is about imagination, what a nation dares to believe is possible and what it dismisses as fantasy. Germany believed in terror and spectacle, and so it built machines that roared but ultimately failed. The Allies believed in collaboration and persistence, and so they built devices that whispered, detonated, and saved a city. On that late August day in 1944, when 82% of Hitler's vengeance weapons were destroyed before reaching their target, the nature of war shifted. It was not a victory won by pilots in desperate duels or soldiers charging barricades. It was a victory forged in factories, by women soldering glass tubes, by engineers perfecting circuits, by commanders willing to bet on secrecy and scale. London stood not because of a single act of heroism, but because thousands of invisible sparks burned inside shells fired from coastal guns. The lessons resonate even now. Technology that multiplies existing strength is more valuable than any singular wonder weapon. Industrial collaboration beats isolated genius. And above all, arrogance, the belief that something is impossible, can be fatal. Germany's refusal to imagine proximity detonation was as decisive a mistake as any lost battle. But there is a human lesson, too. Behind every statistic, 40,000 fuses produced daily, 22 million built by war's end, stood people. The workers in Ohio and New York who never knew what they assembled. The mothers in London who prayed for silence after the buzz. the prisoners in underground camps who were forced to build weapons meant to terrorize. Each life was woven into the fabric of this technological duel. That is why history matters. Not as dry numbers, but as a drama of choices, mistakes, and unexpected triumphs. The V-1 was meant to crush morale. Instead, it revealed resilience. The proximity fuse was meant to be invisible. Instead, it became one of the war's quiet heroes. Together, they tell us that the smallest invention can decide the largest battles. And if you followed this story to its end, you felt the tension. How close London came to ruin, how thin the margin of survival was, and how a fist-sized device turned terror into failure. This is only one of the hidden duels of World War II. There are countless others, stories where technology, courage, and chance intertwined to decide the fate of millions. If you want to uncover more of these forgotten battles, where history reads like a thriller and technology becomes a character in the drama, make sure you stay with this channel. Subscribe, share, and keep the conversation alive. Because the past is not just a set of dates, it is a battlefield of ideas. And sometimes, understanding why one tiny spark mattered can change how we see the present. The Germans never knew what felled their V-1s. They launched thousands of missiles, trained their best crews, trusted their finest engineers. Yet their weapons fell burning into the sea, defeated not by courage alone but by imagination harnessed to industry. That is the final irony. They lost not to a bomb more powerful, but to a fuse so small it fit in the palm of a hand. And in that irony lies the enduring lesson. Victory is not only about the weapons you build, but about the possibilities you refuse to dismiss.